Hello and welcome, everybody. My name is Ailish Roberts. I'll be your host for tonight's webinar, which is going to be all about balancing wildlife and pests in your garden, which I'm sure you already know. Before we get started, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land that I'm on today, the Bunurong people of the Kulin Nations, and pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and I acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded. So we have a fantastic lineup of speakers for you today, full of plenty of expertise, and hopefully you can all get some of your queries covered. I welcome Ricardo Simeo, who is the Manager of Environmental Systems at the Royal Botanic Gardens, Cranbourne. We have Tim Bloomfield, our pest animal consultant from the Victorian Rabbit Action Network. And we have Pete Mantell, who is a professional wildlife controller. Today we'll be focusing on snakes. He's also known as Mr. Slytherin because that is his business. So today, yes, we'll start with Ricardo, who's going to talk all about wildlife gardening and how you can support native wildlife in your garden. I'm then going to talk, I'm Ailish. I'm the Southern Brown Bandicoot Outreach Officer at the Royal Botanic Gardens. You may know me as the Bandicoot Lady. So I will be talking a little bit about bandicoots, but also on baits and a little bit about managing those like pests like rodents and mollusks, so your slugs and snails. Tim's then going to talk all about all things rabbits, and Pete will go on to snakes. So we've got the option for you to ask questions throughout the webinar. Hopefully you can see just on that page, you can ask questions. I'll just point out that each speaker will give their presentation and hopefully will cover most things that might be on your mind as it is, but then they'll have a little bit of time at the end for any specific questions. So unfortunately, we probably won't get around to everyone's question, but you do have the ability to actually thumbs up a question. So if your question's already been asked, feel free to just thumbs it up and it'll actually rise to the top of the pile and we can try and prioritize that one. Alrighty, so without further ado, I'd like to introduce Ricardo Simeo. As I said, he's the Manager of Environmental Systems at the Royal Botanic Gardens in Cranbourne. Ricardo is responsible for the protection and enhancement of the significant remnant flora and fauna of the Cranbourne Gardens site. Starting out his career in local government, he's worked in the field of conservation and land management for over 20 years. Ricardo believes that we cannot rely solely on governmental agencies and protected areas to conserve species. To prevent the current extinction crisis, we must become enamored with nature and create habitats in our own gardens, linking patches of bushland habitat that are currently fragmented by the urban and rural environment. So to help promote this idea, Ricardo sits on the Guns for Wildlife Victoria board, which you'll hear all about. Take it away, Ricardo.
Yes, good evening, everyone. Today, as Ailish said, I'm talking about wildlife gardening, and I'll go through some definitions and then talk about some of the reasons for and benefits of doing it. Then I'll cover some aspects of how to do it, some important elements and principles. I can't possibly cover all the complexities and opportunities on this topic in 15 minutes. So some of it will be quite general. I apologize. But lastly, I'll provide some further resources that you may choose to explore in your own time and at your own pace. What is wildlife gardening? There are many ways to think of it. It's a way to create habitat for local native flora and fauna in your own backyard, garden, or even a balcony, a small space. It's a practice that supports biodiversity, and it's gardening in a way that supports the unique and special plants and animals native to our area. It's also known in other circles as habitat gardening or backyard restoration. But basically, at its simplest, it's a form of conservation and land management. So why do it? A little bit on the sad end of things, but um, this slide is showing you the current extent of native vegetation cover. So that's the green shaded area there, with basically 66% having been cleared since British invasion. Zooming in a little bit into the greater Melbourne area, these two Google Earth satellite images show the last 40 years of development. It's a bit difficult to take in this whole scene, so just focus on that red circle there, and I will go to the next slide, and hopefully you got to see the change. And the same repeats to the north and west of Melbourne as the fastest growing corridors. Zooming in again a little bit closer to home. So this is where I work. The red outline is the Royal Botanic Gardens Cranbourne site, and it's one of the last remaining locations for the southern brown bandicoot in the greater Melbourne area. This is as it was in 1984. So predominantly a rural landscape with lots of farmland, and fast track to today, 40 years, 40-year period again, lots of residential now, as well as industry as the main land use change. So we can start seeing some of the impacts that wildlife have had to deal with over that period. I'll zoom in a little bit further still, but back to 2006, and you can see to the top of the map is the southern end of the gardens there, the Royal Botanic Gardens Cranbourne. Quite a fragmented landscape already, but at least some green tree corridors. Only a few roads in the landscape there. Long grass through winter would have still provided for a variety of reptiles, frogs, and small birds, and mammals, which would have supported top-level predators like birds of prey. I'm talking about things like eagles and falcons and kites, etc. This is 18 years later, so not that long a period, but you can now see a lot of fences impeding wildlife movements, a lot of roads, and much less vegetation cover. And what vegetation there is does not support native wildlife in the same way as it did. So even where a wildlife corridor was provisioned there, just to the top right of the screen, it serves primarily as a shared path and stormwater drain. So I'll zoom into that little red square on the right of the screen, center right of the screen. And that's part of the a section of the wildlife corridor. You can see the trouble that animals like wallabies, kangaroos, koalas, echidnas would have in this kind of landscape to move around. And that's a fairly recent photo of building the new suburbs around the gardens. That swamp wallaby on the bottom right corner of the picture there looks a little bit lost as to where to go next. So why do it? We have certainly lost many species since European settlement in Australia. And whilst some of it's historic, something like the microbat at the bottom of the picture there is very recent, 2009. And we had our first Australian reptile known to have become extinct in 2014. You can see some of the statistics popping up on your screen. A bit of a sad story. And if you consider that on average, we are describing about 1,000 new species in Australia each year, if we keep going at that rate with what we think is the overall amount of species still to be discovered, it's going to take us 400 years to complete even a first pass of Australia's biodiversity. So we're certainly potentially losing species that Western science hasn't even discovered or described yet. Okay, now to some more positive reasons. There is actually more land in private hands than in public hands, so it makes total sense to invest in this sector. And whilst it's easy to write cities off, You can see from some of those numbers, again, popping up on the screen, that cities and urban areas clearly have a role to play when it comes to conservation. Our gardens can become places of last refuge and stepping stones to larger habitat areas. And here's a very shouty robin. This is a piece that I found on the internet recently, published by the Daily Mail. We already know that there are many physical and mental health benefits by immersing ourselves in nature. But this particular study was interesting, and it basically looked at 26,000 people and interviewed them, and basically the level of satisfaction for living near particularly birds. And basically what it equates to is that for every $1,000 or pounds extra for extra new bird that you can be surrounded by. So there you go. If you're feeling unloved by your employer, you should get wildlife gardening. And remembering that in doing so, you're actually storing carbon, so taking carbon from the atmosphere, and assisting to reduce the urban heat island effect. So how do you do it? Well, in simple terms, we just need to provide food, shelter, and water. In other words, provide habitat. The best way to do is to observe nature, so it provides us with all the clues we need. Visit a local bushland for some inspiration. And the idea is really to support the local flora and fauna, the plants and animals that used to live in the forests and woodlands before they were cleared. Basically what we call plants and animals indigenous to the local area. This slide's just showing you that planting in layers really provides the most benefit and supports the most number of species. But look, if you're lucky enough to still retain some remnant indigenous plants on your property, then guard it. And this is some real life examples of what it could look like if you have the space. So native grasses, sedges and rushes, they're incredibly overlooked when thinking about supporting wildlife, which is a shame really, because they support a wide range of species from seed-eating birds to being important host foods for our local butterflies. And put simply, a lot of our local butterflies would go extinct if these plants disappear. These are what I like to call champion trees, and these trees are the species that will significantly restore urban biodiversity. These are known to support a wide range of insects and, in turn, small insectivorous birds. Most trees in Melbourne today are not native to Melbourne, and as an example, across 16 studies, global insect populations have declined by 45% since 1970, taking much of the rest of life around them with them. Introduced plants have been cited as one of the major contributors to this decline. And then in addition, we use insecticides liberally in the landscape, which don't discriminate what they kill. Introduced trees in general, including those from other parts of Australia, will degrade ecosystem function, but indigenous trees, and some more than others, can be used to repair local food webs. Remember, this list is focused mainly on the Sandbelt region of Melbourne, so that's from the Melbourne CBD to Frankston and Cranbourne, and it's bound by Princess and South Gippsland Highway. But most of these are quite widespread in Victoria as well. This selection of small plant heroes is based on a recent study in Melbourne. If you don't have much space, these could be grown in pots and still be providing quite an important food source for our tiny pollinators. So even small spaces can be quite important. And of course, many species like this owlet nightjar hollow dependent. So hollows take over 100 years to develop, mainly in eucalypts, so they are in very short supply. So retain, retain, retain. Even patches of bare soil can be quite important for some insects. Many spiders and native wasps and bees have burrows or nests underground, like the ones in these pictures. Most of these are important pollinators, as well as parasites of other invertebrates, so keeping a check on other insects. This slide is really just introducing some of the concept of artificial structures. So you can see there's some nest boxes and some water, supplying some water. So all those elements are good, but the natural elements are the best. But if you're missing some of those natural elements, or you're building towards having those on your garden, some of these artificial elements can be quite handy in the interim. And of course, water sources, whether just a small bowl or a larger frog pond, if you have the space, is quite important. I have birds using my water bowl through winter just to jump in and have a splash and clean their feathers. And of course, logs and rocks are very important for reptiles, but invertebrates. So when we talk about invertebrates, they're insects, spiders, worms, crustaceans, and other bugs also rely heavily on both standing and fallen timber and are dependent on very specific microclimates. I pay particular attention to bugs and insects in my garden. That's because they make up the basis of a balanced food web. They are pollinators, decomposers, pest controllers, and of course food for other creatures. The problem is that insecticides don't discriminate. So if you use them, you may well be killing the very insects that would be keeping other insect populations in check. The sign of a functioning ecosystem is chewed on leaves. Let's take a moment to appreciate the beauty of nature's interconnections. Most of our native birds that rely heavily on insects, these insects are primarily plant feeders, and they're picky eaters at that. They stick to a small number of plant species, sometimes even just one, and it's all about what they've evolved with. When these plants disappear, sadly, so do the insects. If you consider that the bird community in our landscape should be about 80% small birds, small bush birds, that is, the insectivorous kind, but is now less than 1% in our urban and peri-urban landscapes. Many of the invertebrates that you might find in the garden are very beneficial to your garden, and will keep other insects in check. Things like assassin bugs on the top left side there, robber flies, dragonflies, lacewings, lady beetles, mantids. They all prey on things like aphids and other sap-sucking or leaf-eating insects. Keeping the garden diverse in these will absolutely greatly assist you. Of course, they are themselves sustenance for the rest of the food chain. And of course, our eight-legged friends also play a huge role in keeping insect populations in check. I'll just talk a little bit about living with wildlife, but look, a lot of people do feed wildlife, and while this can be an enjoyable exercise, it's usually will do more harm than good. Feeding wildlife can result in a number of complications. It can result in them becoming dependent on humans for food, losing their fear of humans. For example, kangaroos and wallabies, they get very aggressive and could kick and scratch people when they're regularly fed, when they beg for food. Contracting diseases, dietary deficiencies, so feeding them the wrong things, and artificial food can lead to overabundance and affect adversely affect other species as well. It can cause problems for humans. I think we've probably all heard of cases where cockatoos are fed by someone in the neighbourhood and then start chewing a whole bunch of other things. And that's because they need to maintain their beaks at the correct length and condition. So that's what they do, they chew. But when they're in great numbers because they're being artificially fed, it starts causing everyone in the neighbourhood a headache. Some of the other things that you may wish to do, which doesn't necessarily involve planting or providing habitat, could be confining cats and dogs from a known wildlife area in your garden. I don't keep cats, but some awesome friends of mine do, and they have a cat run. I have dogs, so I keep them away from the native garden via a fence. Also, remember, if you're using fruit netting, it should be a mesh size of less than 5 millimeters. So basically, if you can put your little finger through it, it's no good. So better still, you could bag individual flowers of fruit or share some of the produce with the wildlife. Okay, so now I'll just jump into some resources. If you go into Google Maps, put in a search for Indigenous Nursery, which is what I did here, you should get similar results to the above. You can zoom in and out of the area on the map. But basically, I've circled some nurseries that are community or council-based nurseries, both in this slide and the next slide. I'd like to support these types of nurseries. They are not-for-profit. So that's the first thing I look at when I'm looking for an Indigenous nursery supplier, that they are community-based or council-run. And as Ailish said, I sit on the Gardens for Wildlife Victoria Management Board. Basically, Gardens for Wildlife Victoria programs are run within many municipalities these days, including soon a New South Wales local government area. So that's excellent. We might be going national. You can see there in the map, the blue areas are the currently participating affiliated programs. The map is slightly out of date though, with Geelong being the latest to join there. But basically, if there's a program in your municipality, just go to your council's website, register your interest in participating. And whilst each program runs a slightly different process, you'll get some advice and likely some free Indigenous plants to get you started. And you can visit the Gardens for Wildlife Victoria website and look at some resources there as well. There is also a Facebook group if you've got access to Facebook. Over 6,500 people, all of them very generous with their time and knowledge. So you can ask any questions that you like, no matter how simple or where you may be starting from. A couple of good books I always like to refer people to. The first one is Habitat by A.B. Bishop, and That Guide to Victorian Wildlife by Angus McNabb. I've put 4 websites up there that you should definitely visit. VicFlora is a website that basically describes all the wild plants in Victoria, both native and introduced. And it's good to work out if something is native to your area or not. iNaturalist is a citizen science platform. It's good for exploring what's in your area, lots of participants, and you can start documenting what you see whilst contributing to citizen science. There is image recognition software and confirmation by community to help you identify the species that you've posted. Wildlife Victoria, of course, if you come across any injured wildlife, Wildlife Victoria would be my first port of call. And of course, CSIRO Publishing, where there's a multitude of relevant books to guide your wildlife gardening journey. And I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you, Ricardo. Yeah, it's absolutely awesome stuff. And I can't emphasize enough how rewarding it is to not only be planting natives, but then to see the wildlife in your own backyard and the butterflies and the insects and the small birds. We only have time for just one or two questions. There's a really great one here. Ricardo, what are 3 easy to look after plants that you'd recommend for a beginner gardener who wants to create habitat?
Oh, geez. Okay, on the spot. Look, I really like it was on one of the slides that I had hop gardenias. So Gardenia ovata, a nice little bush that attracts a lot of insects. Um, one of our native bees is very attracted to it. What we call the blue banded bee, the Amygilla species of bees. Um, and you can pretty much hack it. Just keep pruning it back and to keep it under control. But yeah, it just provides a whole bunch of benefits. And then look, I really like the grasses. I think they provide really good opportunities for wildlife. And as I mentioned, butterflies. So anything like kangaroo grass, or even weeping grass or wallaby grass. Some of the poas are quite beautiful, and they are used to getting nibbled by our herbivores, so wombats and kangaroos and wallabies. Yeah, I would go for some of those.
Awesome. Thank you, Ricardo. And a reminder to everyone to keep the questions coming. There's a few rabbit questions, but we'll save them for Tim. I think maybe one more. How can I encourage my local council to join the Gardens for Wildlife program, Ricardo?
That's a good one. Yeah, we get asked that a lot. Look, the easiest way is to approach, if there's a local environment group, approach them and get them on side, because then you've got a group of well networked people, and get their support, and then approach council. Now you can either approach an individual officer, so someone in the conservation team, for instance, or the environment team, is always a good place to start, or approach a councillor. So have a chat with a couple of councillors and gather some support from the councillor base, and then go from there. Once you've got maybe one officer and hopefully a councillor on board, then contact us at Gardens for Wildlife Victoria, and we'll assist the process from there.
Awesome. Well, if we have time at the end, we could revisit some questions, but we'll see how we go. I have a feeling we're going to have lots of questions, which is fantastic. And I might take over. So I guess I'll introduce myself. Hello. If you didn't catch it at the start, my name's Ailish Roberts, and I have the pleasure of working alongside Ricardo at the Royal Botanic Gardens Victoria in Cranbourne, where I am the Southern Brown Bandicoot Outreach Officer. So I spend my time trying to raise awareness about these fantastic critters, and helping make sure that they can persist for a long time in the suburbs. So I won't be talking about bandicoots actually for most of this talk, but I just wanted to give a bit of context to sort of from where I'm coming from, and why I'll start talking about baits, poisons, and managing garden pests in a moment. So if you don't know, Southern Brown Bandicoots are a small to medium marsupial. That means they have a pouch just like a koala or a kangaroo. They're native to Southern Australia, and sadly they are nationally endangered. They were once very, very widespread and abundant throughout Southern Australia, even thought of as being one of the most common mammals pre-European invasion, but they unfortunately are now quite rare. And we're so incredibly lucky that at the Cranbourne Gardens, we have a population of around 200 to 300 Southern Brown Bandicoots. And this is an incredibly significant population. It's certainly the closest, it's one of the last remaining, if not the last remaining metropolitan populations of southern brown bandicoots, or at least the sort of the largest of those. So if you're from Melbourne, this is as close as they get to the city. Now, before we proceed, it's very important that we make sure, can everyone identify a bandicoot from a rat? Because they do get confused. I think once you know a few key features, you won't confuse them for rats again. But you can probably see where I'm heading here. If they get confused for rats, it means sometimes bandicoots might end up accidentally becoming targets of pest control. So please put in the chat which of these, A, B, C, or D, that you think is a southern brown bandicoot. And I'll give you a clue. We've got a southern brown bandicoot, and then we have 3 different species of rats. Okay, so the answer is A, is a southern brown bandicoot. You can see they've got a really round rump, a long pointy snout, and a short stumpy tail. And they've also got really long, strong claws. And if we compare it to our rat species, they've got kind of tiny little claws. They don't have such a pointy nose, and they usually have longer tails. I will point out though that, and yes, everyone's done incredibly well guessing A. Good job. So I will point out that there's a native swamp rat there next to the bandicoot. So not all rats are invasive species. We do have native rats that need to be protected and loved. So just, yeah, good to be aware of. Now, just because I need to touch on Ricardo's presentation, if you are lucky enough to live near bandicoots and you have the opportunity to provide some habitat for them, on the screen I have some plants that would do very well for bandicoots. So they love long strappy grasses or grass-like species. So your tussock grasses like your poas or your lomandras, your sags, juncus, dianella, of course, going off Ricardo's recommendation, please, it's worth consulting your local Indigenous nursery or your council for which species will be best for your area. But yeah, usually if you're going with those strappy native grasses, yeah, the bandicoots will love them. Now, the reason that I want to talk about baits and poisons is that, unfortunately, bandicoots often fall victim to non-target poisoning. So not only do they get confused for rats, but a lot of the time, even if you didn't intend on poisoning a bandicoot, they're the sort of animal that will kind of, you know, see a bit of bait and think it's pretty yummy, and that's really not great for an endangered species. So it could be your slug and snail bait that you put out on your veggie patch, or your rat sack, or whatever rat and mouse bait you use. These things affect a lot of animals and not just bandicoots. And the problem is that I want to focus on is what we call second generation anticoagulant rodenticides. So a lot of the baits that you can just get off the shelves at Bunnings or the supermarket are what we call second generation anticoagulant rodenticides, or SGARs. This is like the vast majority of baits that are just available on our shelves here in Victoria and in Australia. And they're actually a massive problem. So what happens is you might put that bait out, you might have it in a tamper-proof box, much like in this picture here. That's sort of one step to trying to prevent non-target species from accessing them. But I'll show you in a moment a picture of a bandicoot actually getting inside these supposedly tamper-proof boxes. So even then, they're not absolutely foolproof. So you might get a mouse going in there, or a rat, but what then happens is these baits take a really long time to kill. So they're very slow, painful killers. It's not a very nice experience for that animal that you're trying to target. And in that time, they're very vulnerable to predation from something like a raptor or an owl, or, you know, any kind of animal that might want to prey on a mouse or a rat. And of course, that can also mean our pet dogs or our pet cats. So, or your neighbor's pet cat or pet dog. So these mice take a really long time to die. They're very drowsy. They might come out in the sunlight. They're very slow. And that means that we have animals, like often our native animals or our pets, preying on them. And because these poisons take so long to break down in the system, the poison carries on to that animal that preyed upon the bird, that preyed upon the rat. And of course, it can also just happen right at the beginning there, where you could leave the bait out and find that an animal that you didn't mean to find the bait finds it, like a possum, like a bandicoot. So these second generation anticoagulant rodenticides, it is a mouthful, isn't it? They're actually heavily regulated across North America, Europe, and the UK. They are not something that you can just get off the shelves in many, many parts of the world. But here it's kind of a bit of a free-for-all, but you can probably understand why there would be really strict regulations in other parts of the world. So this high risk of non-target poisoning, just to give a few examples, there was a survey done in 2022 that found that 9 in 10 Australian vets have treated pets for poisoning from escars. And BirdLife Australia also surveyed deceased powerful owls, so a threatened native species of owl, and found that these poisons were present in 37 out of 38 deceased powerful owls. So they're preying upon rodents that have been poisoned. It's really, really common. It's really rife in our environment. So they bioaccumulate. So even if a raptor or an owl eats a rat that's poisoned and that one doesn't kill it, you know, it stays in the system. So the next one that it eats, the level of poison in that animal's body will keep increasing. So they stay in our environment. Now, if you're interested in the active ingredients, if you want to check your mouse bait at home, I've got them on the screen here. But ultimately, I'm going to try and encourage everyone to just steer away from baits in general. So there are other baits, FGARs, first generation anticoagulant rodenticides. So in other words, they're not persisting in the environment in that same way. They act really quickly, so it means they're quick killers, but it also means they don't bioaccumulate. So if a mouse dies from that bait and an animal eats it, that secondary animal isn't going to receive the poisoning. And I've got the active ingredients there on the screen, so particularly sodium, chloride, and warfarin we see. Now, I'm not encouraging use of these baits, but I do think if you're going to use baits as a last resort, if I can't sell it for you, I'd probably recommend thinking about avoiding the second generation ones. I would choose a block form. So putting loose pellets out in the ground or out in your house or in your backyard obviously is just, you know, very available for any animal to come and take. And if you live in a bandicoot area, the other thing is in that tamper-proof box. So you've got a block, hopefully you've put it in a tamper-proof box and you're actually raising it around 50 centimeters off the ground, because bandicoots can't actually climb, well, they're not very good climbers, unlike rats and mice. I will show you here though, that even when you do everything right, bandicoots or other critters might find their way into a bait station. So you can probably see there, this little bandicoot has weaseled its way inside this bait station, his little head's poking out. So yeah, baits are just really, you're sort of playing with fire. But I understand that it's not easy. And when we have pests, it's very frustrating. It's a problem. So I want to just go over a few alternatives for you. So when it comes to rodents, making your property less attractive to the rodents is going to be your first port of call. So sealing potential access points, that could mean putting steel wool in all the holes in your house. I know I've done that in my house. Storing your pet food and your human food away from the rodents, removing fallen fruit from trees, keeping your garden waste, your yard and your shed tidy, and even doing things like rodent proofing your compost bin by installing mesh at the base. I don't have time to go into detail on these things, but I will be pointing you in the direction of BirdLife Australia. They have a fantastic resource, which I've popped down the bottom there. It's what to buy and what to avoid. So they have a really good list and go into detail on the more sort of ethical and wildlife friendly solutions to these problems. But also, live traps or snap traps, you're going to not have that risk of baiting other animals. Okay, so just quickly, slugs and snails. A few things you can do in your backyard. You really don't need to use baits. There's so many other ways. So using the formatting's gone a bit funky, but using a copper tape barrier. So if you've got raised beds, you can put copper tape around the sides of that bed, and slugs and snails actually, they get a little electric shock when they cross the copper. So it is easy to get from, Bunnings or any hardware store. That's one solution. A beer trap is incredibly effective. So slugs and snails are drawn to yeast. And so if you've got, again, I'd recommend you just Google beer traps and how to make them. They're a super easy DIY, and you can also buy them from the store if you would like. But as you can see, I've just used a takeaway container. It couldn't be easier to do. You pour some beer in there and come and check it the next morning, and you'll find that you've probably got a lot of slugs that have probably died quite a happy death in their beer trap. You can use a few other methods. So coffee grounds and seaweed act as really good deterrents. Of course, slugs and snails don't like salt, so seaweed is salty. Citrus halves work similar to a beer trap. So you can scoop out the pulp of a grapefruit, put it in your backyard, and you'll find in the morning that a lot of them have crawled into there to have a little nibble. And you can just throw that in the bin. So you can create barriers using other things like crushed eggshells or nutshells. That texture is really uncomfortable for slugs and snails to cross. And of course, encouraging wildlife. If you've got a fantastic bird garden that is you've got lots of great plants for birds, so you're having lots of birds coming to your garden, they're going to be eating a lot of your slugs and snails. Now, I will just spruik while I've got you all here. If you're interested in bandicoots, and I can see quite a few bandicooty questions coming through, which is fantastic, please join the Bandicoot Brigade. You can scan the QR code here or follow the link if you're not already. You'll hear more from me about what we can all do for bandicoots, essentially. And I will leave just probably, I don't have too long for questions, do I, Ricardo? But
No,
yes, if there's any, I will answer it.
there's a couple there. I think you answered some of the ones along the way anyway, Ailish, but there's a good one in here. On top of being super cute, are there any additional benefits of bandicoots being in your backyard? They seem to
Absolutely.
do a lot of digging.
Yeah. So southern brown bandicoots, I did want to talk about this, and I knew I'd go over time, so I cut it out of my presentation. So I'm glad it's been asked. So southern brown bandicoots are what we call ecosystem engineers. So they spend their days digging little holes, and these holes are quite specific. They're very tapered, so very different to rabbit diggings. And in 1 year, a southern brown bandicoot can turn over nearly 4 metric tons of soil. But what they're doing as they're digging is they're circulating nutrients throughout the environment. They're helping water penetrate into the soil. They also spread beneficial fungi in their poop. And honestly, a whole host of other amazing things that they do. So if you have bandicoots in your backyard, don't sort of think, oh no, they're digging holes. They're actually doing you a huge favor. These holes have been keeping our soil spongy and fertile and rich for years and years and years and years. So yes, bandicoots are absolutely wonderful for your garden and for your backyard. Anything
Fantastic.
else?
Well, look, this one is probably well, either you or I can answer this one. Can I have a wildlife-friendly backyard even if I have pets? And my answer
Yeah,
to that is absolutely yes. I think I covered a little bit of that in my talk, but I think fencing is just the easiest way in terms of dogs. That's how I keep my dogs out of the main habitat part of the garden, and of course cat enclosures or cat runs are becoming very popular now. People are cluing on to the fact that cats do have quite a big impact on our wildlife. So containing them is good for the wildlife and the cat because it keeps them
absolutely.
safe.
Yeah, so cats are one of the biggest threats to bandicoots, cats and dogs. So yeah, keeping our cats indoors or in a cat run, absolutely, Ricardo. Great. Is that
I
we'll
think
end
that,
it there. We've probably
yeah, I think we'll
got to
have
move on.
to.
Plus, I
Yep.
can see lots of interest in what Tim is about to talk about. So, I'd like to introduce Tim Bloomfield, who has 47 years of experience in pest and land management across roles in state governments, councils, and private businesses in Victoria and interstate. He has helped develop, manage, and implement environmental strategies and action plans for governments and community groups on rabbits, foxes, feral pigs, and wild dogs in rural and urban landscapes. Thank you, Tim.
Thank you very much. So we'll talk about rabbits, and the first part of it we'll talk about why they're so successful. And I suspect if you're tuned in because you've got rabbits, you're aware that they're fairly successful on your place. One of the things that ensures rabbits are doing well is that they're a Mediterranean species brought to a country with a Mediterranean climate. They came from Spain, they got to Australia, and when they got here, they got a lot of help by the English colonists, but they are also greatly advantaged by large numbers of burrowing native animals, and they're also greatly advantaged by people clearing the native vegetation and planting things like introduced exotic grasses, and they generally did that because they tended to be high protein food sources for sheep and cattle. That's ideal for rabbits. They only need about 12 to 14% protein to breed. If they've got that, they do. They're a boom bust animal, like many animals, many Australian animals. With burrow systems, you've got rabbits. And the more burrow systems you've got, the more rabbits you're going to get. So let's just look at how we manage them. And there's been more than 60 years of fairly applied research on rabbits in Australia. And it has shown how to actually manage them so that you don't have ongoing rabbit problems. Now, I'll just go through this for a start, and I'll bring this up again when we move through some of the issues that rabbits might be causing you and the manners you can deal with them. But generally, the first process is to reduce their numbers so that when you do the process of managing their burrows, you haven't got rabbits digging back into that. Now, that process of knocking numbers down is usually done with a bait. It can be done with other methods. Baiting is the method generally used, but it can also be done without baiting, provided you do this bit, which is find all the burrows in the harbour that the rabbits are under. And that harbour tends to be weeds, particularly things like woody weeds or spiny weeds. It might also be under sheds or can even be under houses, particularly houses on stumps. It can be under that pile of stuff at the backyard you're going to clear away one day. The next process is to ensure that any burrows that you've treated and modified so that rabbits can't get back into them, and that's usually a process of using something like a small excavator, or if you're very, very keen, digging them out so that the rabbits can't dig back into them and then closing those off. This process works, and it has worked for a long period of time. I've personally done it for a number of decades. It's very successful when you manage the burrows. Rabbits must have burrow systems to breed in. A baby rabbit born above ground, this small pink hairless little creature, won't make it. Born in a burrow, it's sheltered from climatic extremes, reduce the chance of predators, and its chances of survival are really high. So I mentioned a process before of knocking numbers down so they're not digging into your burrows. One of those products that's used in urban areas is Pindone. Pindone and Alicia mentioned it before. She didn't mention it. She mentioned first generation rodenticides, and that's what Pindone is. And it was first pioneered over in WA to be used in areas there for rabbit control. It then became obvious that it could be used in urban areas rather than the other product, sodium monofluoroacetate or 1080. It's quite effective in the process of killing rabbits. It's a multiple dose poison. Now, one of the things its advantages it has is that dogs, if they're observed early enough after consuming, and it would have to be multiple rabbits, can be treated with a product of vitamin K. Properties must be greater than 1,000 square metres for you to use the product. Now, you can go to Bunnings and you can buy, it might be Shotgun, or I think it is. You can also buy rabbait or bunny bait from agricultural suppliers. You can only use it on your property if the property is greater than 1,000 square metres. Now, there are two things that you mix baits with. I should say the toxins with. One is oats and the other is carrots. I'm a very much an oats type person. It also reduces uptake by marsupials as well. I'd stress this quite strongly, that you shouldn't use pindone if native animals are in that area where you're going to feed. Put down oat bait that is untreated, so you can just buy feed oats. This is not Uncle Toby's oats. This is the oats that you might give to the horse. Place that in the area where you observe the rabbits are feeding. You can make a little trail, use a hoe, and just dribble some oats into that. Now you can observe that. Rabbits in urban areas are often quite unafraid of humans. They've got used to humans, another one of their little adaptations, and observe what's feeding that. You can put a wildlife camera out there and do the same thing. If you observe native animals feeding on that, don't bait. The chances are that you could have native animals consuming a toxic amount. Always read the label and always follow the instructions. This is an example of programs where baiting's the only method that's been used. Now, each time the population of rabbits, which is there in the, about 1985, it's something like about 60 or 70 rabbits a spotlight kilometre. And a spotlight kilometre is, in a distance of 1 kilometre, it's the rabbits that you count, basically 50 to 60 metres away from you, the observer. This is in the Rowsley Valley in Bacchus Marsh, which was a grand place for a dam, but they made it an agricultural area, and it's a fantastic place for rabbits. It got up to over 200 rabbits a spotlight kilometre. So an annual baiting program sees rabbits return. It's because the burrow systems are still there. Any survivors of the program have still got burrows to breed in, and they quickly outbreed the control measure. The same thing would happen to you if it's the only method that you use in the control of rabbits. Any program with rabbits has got to be integrated. You have to use a number of different methods and use them at the right time and in the right sequence. First thing that you got to do on your property, you can do this on the council land too if you feel like, is find where they live. And blackberries, briars, boxthorn, woody weeds are ideal for rabbits. You can see a couple of rabbits there in front of the burrow system. They're just young rabbits. They're probably 70 or 80 days old, something like that. They'll be very close to the burrow system because they want to run back in soon. Now, all rabbits disperse, which means that those young rabbits will be kicked out by the adults, which means that if you don't have rabbits, you're going to get them, because rabbits move from the burrow systems seeking their own systems. They spread across Australia from 1860 at a speed of roughly 70 kilometres per year. So if you've got rabbits, you're giving the neighbours rabbits. If the neighbours got rabbits, they're giving you rabbits. If you're going to do rabbit control, you should work with your neighbours and with the council and with people like the Botanic Gardens or Parks Victoria, and do it as a group exercise. So clear the weeds, find where the rabbit burrows are, clear those weeds, move that timber, etc. Having located all the burrows, and you can use a little program, it's called Feral Scan. You can download that on your phone. It's from the Centre of Invasive Species Solutions in Canberra. It's got a a little app in there called Rabbit Scan, and you can record the burrows on your place, on the council land. You can do it with your neighbours and show the scale of the problem and the work that needs to be done. If you've got burrows, you're going to have more rabbits, and if you've got rabbits, you're going to have more burrows. Find the burrows, modify them so rabbits can't get them, and then you win. You can do burrow modification in a few ways, and those ways you can use small excavators like 3 ton, 4 ton, bigger machines. Basically, go across larger areas more quickly. They mightn't be suited to your backyard. However, if you decide that what you're going to do is dig them out, and it's nice little sort of sandy loam soil, be assured that you have to be very, very persistent in this effort. Now, here's a site not that far away from the Botanic Gardens where they didn't use any baiting. No baiting was used. Rabbits existed in piles of earth, including dam walls. They existed in basically spots where humans had excavated soil and left banks for rabbits to dig into, and they were living under lots of sheds as well. So the process was to find all the burrows first. In 2019, that was done using Rabbit Scan. That's the little yellow dots. And then each spot where there was a burrow, there was a decision made of how that burrow could be modified so rabbits couldn't live in it. So where it was earth, the burrow was fumigated using a product called aluminium phosphide. And then the burrow was destroyed using a small excavator so that the burrow wasn't available for a rabbit to dig back in. And at the sheds where burrows were possible to get to, they were fumigated, or rabbit-proof netting was placed at the base of those buildings and those containers so that rabbits couldn't dig back under. Now, as time went by, we get to 2020 and we've got fewer burrow systems. Now they're little blue pins down here. But you've got to be very persistent with rabbits. Now, a rabbit-proof fence was put around the whole of the site, and that ensured that those landholders are only dealing with their rabbits and not their neighbours' rabbits. And this is something you have to give consideration to on your property. Are you going to deal with rabbits so that you don't have any rabbits at all? And to do that, you would need a rabbit-proof fence around your property and or part of the property that was most important to you to stop rabbits from getting in. Rabbit-proof fences work. They stop rabbits. And now Elise will talk in a little while, perhaps. She'll show us something that will know about bandicoots to get through that fence. Maybe we'll do that prop at the end, but it's a great idea. So what happened in time and during this process, we started in 2019 on this property, which is about 8 hectares, 9 hectares, something like that. COVID turned up and so that slowed everything down, but we do get to 2023 and there's only one burrow system, which is a little yellow star, left on the place. And it's because all of the burrows were found and each burrow was treated in some way and rabbits couldn't get back in under buildings, vegetation where there were low shrubs, they were lifted, they were trimmed so that the rabbits couldn't find a spot there to dig a burrow system. Now the rabbits have been treated, they've grown back down, which is good for birds and things. So it is possible to do it without using a bait, but you've got to find all the burrows. You need to contain your area so that rabbits aren't getting back into it. But if they are, then it's just going to be an ongoing process. This is one of the ways you can exclude rabbits from under buildings and from under containers. This is using rabbit-proof netting that's attached to the side of the container and then goes out about 300 mil or a foot thereof, pegged down to the ground so that the rabbit can't enter underneath the container or underneath a building. Rabbits will get under buildings, particularly buildings that are on stumps. They'll dig around next to the stumps and next to the chimney, etc. because they've been disturbed areas, and they will cause issues for the stability of that house. They'll also go under concrete slabs as well. But rabbit-proof netting will last 20, 30 years easily. It's a good long-term process. You can put a rabbit-proof fence around your property. There's a couple of products that are useful. Certainly Waratah makes a very good product. It's a double dip galvanized. And if you've got an existing wooden fence or even an existing metal fence, you can place this at the base of that, and they make a product that's actually 300 mil, and you can staple it onto a wooden fence, and then dig the rest into the ground or lay it across the top of the ground to stop it from getting in, and peg that down. We're back to this recipe, and I've thrown in another bit there, which is erect rabbit-proof fence to manage your rabbits. Find all the burrows and exclude rabbits from any of your buildings, and then modify those burrows so that you don't have any active burrows on your place. If what you want to do is have a long-term result, and I mean 20, 30 years, work with your neighbours, work with the council, work with other government authorities, there might be water authorities, and don't have any burrow systems in your neighbourhood. That will make a difference, and it'll make a long-term difference. If you've got rabbits, you'll have foxes. Rabbits are about 40 to 60% of the diet of a fox. I should say no, it's 30 to 40% of the diet of foxes. So they're very, very keen on them. The more rabbits you've got, the more foxes that you're going to have. And then follow up that maintenance where you've destroyed those burrows so they don't reopen. Now, if one of the things you choose to do is just bait, rabbits will come back. If you decide just to fumigate, you're only killing individuals, they'll come back again and again. And just remember, the great success of rabbits was 1860. That was Thomas Austin. Genetically, those rabbits are all across Australia. Recent genetic studies show that they are the ones that spread across Australia. You'll always have rabbits unless you either one, stop them getting in, and or work in the largest area that you possibly can with the neighbours to stop them entering your neighbourhood. And that's it from me from rabbits. And at least maybe you could show your handy prop and describe its excellent use in a rabbit.
Thank you, Tim. That was fantastic. So for anyone who is living with rabbits and bandicoots, and you're wanting to do some exclusion fencing, you could consider putting in a bandicoot gate. So this is a door basically just for bandicoots. They actually use their paw or their nose to open this flap here and go through. Rabbits can use it to leave, but they cannot. We've never seen them being able to open this flap, and we've monitored them a lot. So it's just a piece of PVC pipe. It's about 10 centimeters in diameter. It's got a weighted flap on it just to make sure it stays closed. And this is just a flap to make sure it doesn't flip all the way over. So it's an easy DIY. If you're really interested, you can even inquire at the Botanic Gardens, and I'll get in touch with you. I can see if I can set you up with one, but they're pretty easy DIY. So yeah, you could pop that in your fence, keep the rabbits out, but make sure the bandicoots can still come and go. Now, Tim, I do have some questions for you. Adam says, we have hares on our property. Are these of concern like rabbits?
Hares generally don't get to the same sorts of levels in numbers, but they can be a significant issue for planted trees. They'll come along and they'll just chew the top of them. There is no registered baits for hares. The only control measures for hares is rabbit-proof fencing that will stop hares. Otherwise, it's shoot individual hairs. That's the only way to deal with it. Their interest in trees can be quite significant, and you can get a lot of damage. If you're not getting any damage, then I just wouldn't worry about it.
Gosh, there's quite a lot of questions coming through. Tim, this one's quite tricky. How can I manage rabbits that are coming from neighbouring council land? And
Right. Well, the thing to do is, well, the first thing is, what is it that you want to achieve by not having the rabbits, and other ways of dealing with that. There's a couple of processes. One is a rabbit-proof fence that stops them entering. That might be cost prohibitive for you, or you think you shouldn't have to do it. It's their fence too. Might be a joint opportunity there. I would be inclined to download Feral Scan and open it up at Rabbit Scan and map the borough systems on the council land, and then go to the council and say, how about we do a joint program? I'm going to do my rabbits and you can do your rabbits.
Awesome. Thanks, Tim. I've seen a few questions about the bandicoot gates as well, which is fantastic. I'd like to maybe create a little stash of these that I can give away. So please email me. I did put my email earlier, but it's sbb@rbg.vic.gov.au if you're interested in a bandicoot gate, and I might be able to get you one.
I've got a question for you, Elise.
Yes.
About the bandicoot. Hatch you've got there. Have you tested that on eastern bards?
I don't think we have tested them on eastern bards. Do you know, Ricardo?
No, we haven't. They were very specifically designed for Royal Botanic Gardens and to deal with the native display garden, and so the idea was to keep rabbits out of the native display garden, but allow the bandicoots through. So as far as I know, we do get requests for the design from various other agencies. So the design is out there, and various people are using it, but I'm not aware of any eastern barred bandicoot specific use.
Right, thank you.
I will also say there's been quite a bit of interest in this webinar, whether it will be recorded. It will be, and you can head to the Royal Botanic Gardens Victoria's YouTube channel hopefully within the week, and it might be an abridged version, but you can rewatch the webinar if you wanted to focus on any particular details. Without further ado though, I'd like to introduce Pete Mantell, who has had a keen interest in amphibians and reptiles since childhood and has been an amateur herpetologist for close to 30 years. He holds qualifications in horticulture, training, business, and even venomous snake handling. Since 2016, Pete has owned and operated a family-run wildlife control and demonstration business. He's incredibly passionate about the natural world, and we're very lucky to have him with us today. Thank you, Pete.
Hey, Alice, thanks very much. Thanks for inviting me along to not only the webinar, but a topic that's near and dear and really important and really pertinent too, as the environment's ever changing. So so as Ailish mentioned, my name's Pete Mantell. I do run a wildlife control business. You can see there, we just have a little bit of fun with the name. It's called Mr. Slytherin. It's basically born out of an interest in reptiles and amphibians, which is now pretty much lifelong. So I'll sort of get straight into that talk and hopefully cover off, explain a little bit about myself, but also how one lands at becoming a snake catcher or controller, or working in an area that a lot of people see relatively, I guess, unusual. So Ailish mentioned there that for 30 years I've been an amateur herpetologist. I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. I'll give you a little bit of historical information about snakes and how they sort of not only work in our environment, a little bit about their habit, and also about I'll be fairly sensitive to our local area as well, and the role snakes play in our own local environment, the type of snakes we have. And that's going to be covered in snake identification, Snakes in our gardens is obviously probably the main theme of it, and a lot of aspects of safety and working safely in your gardens. Being also a qualified, pardon me, horticulturalist, that's also born out of interest in gardens. So I'm really sympathetic and quite passionate about the role that, gardens play in our life, the role wildlife and the important role wildlife plays in our gardens, but also the area that I work in is a little bit different, being, venomous snakes are not something that people try to encourage, even though we want to create environments that include, all types of native wildlife. And hopefully we're obviously, it's been a really long and webinar already, and with lots of content, but hopefully we get some time for some questions. But some of the slides obviously made with the intent to try and answer some of those questions, and maybe even answer a few myths along the way that we might have about snakes, full stop. So I mentioned very briefly before, as did Ailish, about being an amateur herpetologist. That just means I'm a hobbyist, if basically it's focused on reptiles. So if you were to come to the backyard at my place here in the Mornington Peninsula, we've got a shed that's completely dedicated to housing, a collection of snakes and lizards and frogs and things like that. So that's really all that means there. I am a licensed wildlife controller and a wildlife demonstrator, which you do need to, when you're dealing with any form of native wildlife, you need to have a license or a permit to do so. There is such a thing as a qualification in venomous snake handling, which I undertook as I was starting this business. I've also got a qualification in horticulture, and for the last 8 or 9 years actually was teaching horticulture in secondary schools. So I've got a fair breadth of sort of experience where I can talk to, I think, both sort of gardening, environment, and some of our native wildlife. Also helps to have a qualification in first aid for some of the animals that I deal with as well. But haven't needed to apply that yet, thankfully. So first slide I put up here, it might seem a bit odd to put a slide up of a bearded dragon just across, garden hose in a backyard, but I took this photo, I think, in about 1983. And this is the backyard in my grandparents' place in Noosa, growing up in southeast suburbs around Springvale. I always had an interest in some local frogs and things, but when I got the opportunity to go on holidays to my grandparents' place, that's where I really got, an interest in all things reptiles, but also from a young age, I really distinctly remembering my grandparents in particular fostering a balance between having animals in your garden, and they were quite enthusiastic gardeners. But at the time I didn't know it, but I was also introduced to what we now know as biological pest control. My grandmother used to walk around and pick grasshoppers off her plants and flick them to the bearded dragons as they walked around her backyard. And, there was everything from green tree frogs and green tree snakes, everything, and everything was encouraged to be in that yard. And that's really what sort of sparked a real passion and enthusiasm, particularly in the field of reptiles. And, cane toads were ever present back then. But I've also seen how they've impacted with a lot of the decline in things like bearded dragons and a lot of snakes up in Queensland over those sort of ensuing decades. But that's sort of where it all started all those years ago, having an interest in the weird field of reptiles. So a little bit of historical information, and you'll find a lot of the slides that I pop up are based out of a lot of questions that I get. And obviously with snakes, there's a lot of myths around snakes, a lot of born out of fear and things like that. And we Aussies love to perpetuate myths, and this, why people want to come to Australia, I don't know, because everyone just tries to tell everybody overseas how scary it is, because we've got all the animals that sort of want to kill you. But if everything in balance is, if we look at the amount of people that unfortunately, lose their lives to animals in Australia, well, interestingly enough, in Australia, for all the venomous snakes we have, it's only around 2 to 3 people per year that succumb to snake bite, and about 10 per year to bee stings from European honeybees. Obviously there's a lot more honeybees, and there's extenuating circumstances, but and you also add in the fact that nearly 90%, if not more, of our snake bites in Australia as a result of a human interaction. There's the odd unfortunate bite and certainly accidental bites, but a lot of people trying to take matters into their own hands and remove snakes, play with snakes, and unfortunately kill snakes is what often leads to our accidents. So I've got to focus on two species of snakes that are really the most common and sort of prolific species around the areas that we're sort of looking at around Cranbourne or even the entire city of Casey, Bayside, Melbourne, and right down through the Mornington Peninsula. There's certainly exceptions, but the copperhead, the lowland copperhead, the lowland copperhead is one of 3 Australian species of copperhead, and the mainland tiger snake are by far the 2 most common species of snakes we find in our region. There are certainly exceptions. Red-bellied black snakes are certainly not as prolific as people think, and eastern brown snakes are certainly not that prolific and almost non-existent in certain parts of southern Melbourne, if you like, or once you move south of the city. So I'll focus largely on these 2 species. And really, I would like to put in everyone's mind that it really doesn't matter, because in Melbourne, nearly every snake you'll ever encounter will be a venomous snake. So the way we treat them from a first aid perspective and a danger perspective is pretty much all the same. It really doesn't matter which is the more venomous or the most toxic or anything like that. We can almost lump them all in together because our first aid protocols are the same, and the treatment is almost the same, again, with some exception. Those 2 pictures, by the way, are both taken on the same day within an area within the Botanic Gardens, just to make everyone feel nice and safe and sound. They were two snakes out basking on a relatively cool day, doing what cool climate snakes do. It was probably in the vicinity of 16, 17 degrees, absolutely perfect for our local cool climate snakes. And they were within about sort of 15, 20 metres of each other, just minding their own business. So, yeah, you can see there, that's the copperhead and the tiger snake, by far our 2 most common species. Okay, so we move into, I guess, the slides that talk about that, are born out of the questions that I get. And it also might answer why snakes actually visit your yard and your properties and things like that. And some things that snakes eat may surprise people too. So particularly with our local species, frogs are a huge part of their diet, really important part of their diet. They eat a lot of frogs. They're not fussy about the species of frogs that they eat. Thankfully, we don't have cane toads down here. Otherwise, I'm sure we would have seen a huge decline in our snake population. As I said, they eat frogs, and which obviously puts them in association with water. They're big reptile eaters, so they eat lizards and they eat snakes. They're all really cannibalistic. Surprisingly, copperheads, being a very shy species, love to dine on tiger snakes and whatever they can overpower. They'll certainly eat rodents, they'll eat mammals, and they'll eat birds. And you can see there at the bottom of that slide, snakes can and do climb. So when I say snakes, I'm sure a lot of people would be familiar with seeing carpet pythons up in the northern part of the country in people's roofs. And a lot of people may think that snakes don't climb trees and stuff like that. Well, nothing could be further from the truth. They may not live in trees and exist in trees, but tiger snakes in particular are really good climbers, and they love to feed on nestling birds, particularly in spring. And they're actually quite good controllers of things like blackbirds and your spotted doves, because those birds tend to nest, within the first sort of couple of metres from the ground, which is a great opportunity for a tiger snake to come and raid a bird's nest, and they'll actually clean out the entire nest. The parents will scurry away. But if there's young nestling birds or hatchling birds in a nest, the tiger snake will come and gorge itself and rid your property of blackbirds, which is quite handy for some people, particularly the mess they make of your gardens. You can see there also in those pictures, sorry if they're a little bit gory, snakes are highly cannibalistic, and they also eat blue tongues, as well as a picture there of a copperhead subduing a baby blue tongue, which also answers a question I get often asked about the association between the 2 species. A lot of people often ask about the presence of blue tongues in snakes, where you can see there that sometimes snakes prey on them. If the blue tongue's too big, a snake will leave it alone. They don't really have any sort of huge association. They don't keep each other away. They won't really want nothing to do with each other, but they don't really keep each other away from your property. Few of the myths. I love the myths. These are always really, really good if you're ever doing a demonstration, or if you're out, maybe relocating a snake. And I'll just park on that little part there. I touched on the fact before about being a wildlife controller versus being maybe a pest controller. With a wildlife controller, obviously my focus and my permit really only allows me to deal with native reptiles. So I don't see things like blue tongues and stuff as a problem. But for reasons that most would be obvious to many, that venomous snakes would often come in contact with our homes. So that may be people, but it's also pets. So there's a need to sometimes relocate our venomous snakes and rehome them. So it's not pest control in my eyes. It is purely wildlife control and risk mitigation, if you like. So I'm very sympathetic to the need to be safe, but I'm also pretty passionate about our wildlife, and snakes fit right into that important framework of our wildlife. So a few myths about snakes, and I've touched on the first one. The presence of one species doesn't mean the lack of another. So if you've got black snakes, it doesn't mean you won't have another one. They're all pretty much cannibalistic. They're all competitive. They're not communal. They don't want anything to do with each other. But if you've got one, you won't have another, et cetera, et cetera. And again, it doesn't matter, particularly in Melbourne. If you've got a snake, it's a venomous snake, really, unless it's an escapee or something like that, or a translocated animal from somewhere else. I mentioned that the presence of blue-tongued lizards doesn't mean you won't have snakes. That's something that comes up quite often, actually. I'm surprised how often I get asked that. Quite often, blue tongues are mistaken for snakes, but if you've got a blue tongue, it doesn't mean you won't have a snake. And it does, just if you've ever seen a snake, it doesn't mean they're there to wipe out your population of blue tongues at the same time. Now, this is the controversial one. I'm happy to always debate this one. Now, remember, I put this one, it's not about debating, but snakes do not, and they will not chase you. I always have a fun sort of debate and argument about this particular point, but if you think about it from a rational perspective, snakes are probably the world's biggest coward in the wildlife field. They want nothing to do with us. They're great at bluffing us. And because so many people are scared, of snakes, and often rightfully so, they'll often run, but thinking that the actions of a lunging snake, trying to defend itself, might be chasing someone. But I've had people try and convince me that they've been chased for several kilometres on foot by an aggressive snake. And it just simply doesn't happen, because even an unfit human that's scared of a snake can outrun the fastest snake. It's just not possible to be run down by a snake that wants to kill you, because they don't, because we're not a prey item. One thing that probably is a bit more relevant to your gardens is Australian snakes, they do not nest. So they don't build nests. That comes up every year about people concerned that snakes might take up residence because they're nesting. So our local species are all live-bearing snakes, our cool climate snakes. And whilst the females have some sort of maternal instinct, once they give birth, they really disperse. They have nothing more to do with their young, and the offspring are then there to fend for themselves. So whilst a female snake that's coming up to giving birth, she'll want to find a shelter site, they don't nest. They don't build a nest. They don't construct a nest. In fact, there's probably only one venomous snake. I'm sure there's more around the world, but the king cobra in Southeast Asia is one of the only snakes really known to create a nest of sorts. But our local snakes don't nest. So you don't have any problems with snakes building nests in your garden. Now, the last one, and this is an important one, is snake repellents do not work. So snake repellents, whether it's chemical or mechanical, I'll focus largely on the mechanical repellents, because you can buy them. You can buy them at big chain stores and online. I'm pretty adamant they don't work. I work closely and have a lot to do with other snake controllers, wildlife controllers, not only here in Melbourne, but around the country. And there's not one of them that I've ever known that says that they work. In fact, lots of tests have been performed in situ with snakes and mechanical repellents or repellers. They simply don't work. In fact, there's many a story that a snake controller can tell about going to a property and having a snake either sitting on top of a solar-powered repeller or underneath it. The reason why I like to be a bit more sort of serious and emphatic about that is I would hate for people to think they can put a repellent or a repeller in their garden and think they're safe, because they just aren't. Nothing worse than a false sense of security when it comes to sort of products that don't work. So if you're thinking about going and spending some money on some solar repellers, I'm sorry if you're a manufacturer, but those products just simply don't work. May change in time, but there's, there may be some sort of home remedy chemicals out there that potentially deter snakes, but how often do you spray them? What impact do they have on your plants or your gardens? How easily are they washed away? All of those sorts of things. So the reality is, unfortunately, repellents don't work. Fencing does work. A lot of, particularly if you are familiar with areas around maybe a botanic ridge around the golf course and stuff, a lot of properties have what you call snake-proof mesh fencing. It does work to a degree. Snakes can climb, as I mentioned, so they can climb over the fence, but it may prevent a snake from entering your property. Those fences need to be maintained and installed 100% correctly, because a snake can move through the smallest of small gap. And our local snakes, unlike our pesky rabbits, they do not excavate holes. So a lot of people may find a snake in proximity of a burrow, but the snakes do not make them. They may occupy a rodent burrow, not usually rabbit burrows, because rabbits, from what I understand, and Tim is certainly the expert on this one, but a rabbit's probably pretty good at defending their own space. But certainly snakes like the tight confines of burrows constructed by other things like rats and mice, and it prevents a bit of a food item for them as well. But they don't make their own holes. There are some snakes that do excavate, but they're more desert species and they're known to dig their own holes. Our local species don't excavate their own holes. So snakes in our gardens, sort of why are they there? Why do people, and I get this asked of me quite a bit, people often ask, why do snakes come into our gardens? I think they more ask it because they don't want them there, but there's a few reasons. And there's no particular order to these, but the bottom one is probably pertinent in that your home exists within the home range of a snake. Snakes have a range that they move in and out of. So that's largely why they come to your house. It's fairly incidental while they're there, and it's usually an accident while they're actually in your property. But if you keep your property free and clean of particularly ground litter, things like timber and firewood and stuff like that, make really, really good shelter sites. Anywhere that's really clean and dry, the warmth doesn't impact them too much. They really want to be dry where they can, and they love tight, confined spaces. So if you can keep your ground litter clean, you'll also remove those shelter sites for any sort of visitors that may be passing through. They're certainly attracted to the smell of rodents. Earlier on, the panelists were talking about chickens and birds, and they're probably the biggest attractors of rodents in mice and rats, and that has a sort of flow-on effect by attracting snakes. A lot of people seem to think that snakes are attracted to chickens and may even be there for the eggs. It's not the case. Chickens are too big to eat, or be eaten, I should say. But mice and rats that are attracted to chicken coops and bird aviaries are a great food source for our snakes. So if you can control those rodents, you're a really good chance of being able to keep the snakes at bay as possible as well. Snakes can certainly be attracted by bodies of water. All our snakes are really, really good swimmers. They drink water. But they also feed on frogs as well. So it doesn't mean they're going to set up shop and just because you have a pond, you're not necessarily going to have 50 snakes around your property. It doesn't quite work like that. But particularly in periods of hot weather, they may come looking just for the coolness of the water and just seeking a drink, if nothing else. So they can be attracted to bodies of water. And like I said, most houses, if you've got a snake, it's because a snake is moving through your property as part of exploring its home range. But they do come and go because snakes have got to eat and they've got to breed. So they're fairly primitive. They want to reproduce and they've got to look after themselves. So if you've got a house where there's not much in the way of a food source or there's no opportunity to reproduce, they'll look to move on. They may return at some point, but they don't always set up shop in your house necessarily. There's a few old photos there you can see having removed snakes from really, really tight, confined spaces, which is what, again, snakes really, really like. Interestingly enough, this has sort of already been touched upon, and for those that may think that the people that all sort of talking tonight sort of conspired, and we didn't. None of us have seen each other's slides really, but it's interesting. There's a lot of crossover in some of our slides. I think Ricardo also already mentioned using bird netting. Bird netting is actually a really a significant problem, particularly with snakes. I've removed many a snake from bird netting entangled. All of those pictures there are live venomous snakes that I've had to remove from bird netting, all of which survive. Every now and then I have had one which has sustained really horrific injuries and they do not survive. The problem there is that with venomous snakes, as you can appreciate, that's a huge risk to try and remove them because they're frightened, they're in pain, and the only way to react when you've got nothing but a mouth is to try and bite. So it's pretty dangerous work removing a snake from bird netting. And again, Ricardo, I think, touched on this earlier, that the laws around the sale of bird netting have recently changed. So you may be using an old type of bird netting to protect your fruit trees. Just check which type it is, because some of that is no longer legally allowed to be sold. And I'd encourage anybody, when you're not using it, regardless of what it is, don't leave it lying on the ground, pack it away. A lot of these incidents happen when the bird netting's actually just been left on the shed floor and wildlife gets caught up in it. So bird netting can actually be, whilst you're trying to protect your bounty of fruit, you can be causing a sort of secondary a layer of problems. And all these are all domestic gardens where people have come home to have a very frightened snake wrapped up in some netting. And once they're in it, they cannot get out. And another thing that we've also touched on is all your forms of pesticides. Now, again, this is a disclaimer. I don't sort of say anything to say you must not do this, you must do that. But there's certain things that I just know to be true, and a lot of it's from firsthand and just having knowledge from a horticultural perspective. And again, unfortunately, there's a picture of a tiger snake there. Fortunately, that tiger snake's actually is deceased. That was a victim of eating a mouse or a rat that had consumed rodenticide, and it fell victim secondary for that secondary poisoning, if you like. So it certainly happens not only in our beautiful fluffy animals and our birds, certainly it happens in reptiles as well, because snakes, they don't just eat live prey, they're opportunistic. So if they came across a dead animal, they'll eat it. It's nothing to see snakes feeding on roadkill and stuff like that. If it looks like food, smells like food, and they can fit it in, they'll eat it. And unfortunately, that can include dead rodents as well. And you may be aware that when a lot of rodents die from rodenticide, they expose themselves for whatever reason. They'll often die out in the open, which makes them an easy target. Insecticides, snail and slug pellets, again, we've touched on those. They create problems, particularly for blue-tongue lizards. Blue-tongue lizards love to eat snails. They're probably the ultimate snail control. If you've got a vegetable garden or any sort of garden and snails are a problem, you really want blue-tongue lizards. They're completely harmless to us, and they love snails. They're a really good source of protein for snails, for the blue-tongues, I should say. But trying to bait your snails can cause secondary poisoning in blue-tongues as well. So that's really, really problematic. And herbicides. It's really, really difficult with herbicides because whilst we love to control our weeds and things like that, there's a range of problems caused by by various herbicides, even the so-called safe herbicides, unfortunately, whereas secondary ingestion for insects and birds. But things like frogs that have permeable skin, so they absorb their moisture through their skin, they don't drink. They can actually succumb and develop problems from granulated controllers, whether it's pre-emergence or whatever it might be. It might be, ant baits and wasp and bee powders, or any spray herbicides. So again, it's not me telling you must not use them, but I'd also I would encourage anybody to sort of seek alternate methods and measures if they're trying to control insects. And what I will back up is what Ailish said earlier about beer traps. I'm astonished at how well beer traps work to control slugs and snails. They are an absolute no-brainer, and they're a great way to get rid of that cheap rubbish beer that you might have in the fridge too. So I would highly, highly recommend you trying out some of those alternate methods, because they work, and sometimes more successfully than over-the-counter insecticides or pesticides. So it's worth sort of giving them a bit of a shot if you can. Of course, staying safe in the garden yourself. This is for obvious reasons, something that comes up all the time. So staying safe in the garden, PPE. So personal protection is pretty obvious. Good quality gloves that are heavy duty. when you're doing your routine maintenance. Sometimes if you're doing some really, you know, intricate work like bonsaiing or pruning, you need some dexterity and it's a bit harder. But if you're just doing general cleanup, it's really good to wear some really heavy duty, even rigging gloves if you can, because our local snakes don't have huge fangs and they'd be very hard pushed to even penetrate some really heavy duty gloves. Wear long pants if you can and it's comfortable, and some cotton canvas workwear or denim long pants. You'd be quite unlucky. It's not impossible. You'd be unlucky for a snake to be able to bite through any of those heavy duty workwear. And of course, don't do what a lot of people do and get around the garden in bare feet or thongs, particularly if you live in an area where you know snakes may be present. Wear heavy duty footwear. Might be nice to prance around the grass in bare feet, and I'm guilty of doing it myself. But if you're not going to step in dog waste, then you may be at risk of actually, getting bitten on the foot from something, or stepping on something that you cannot see. So it's always important to wear really, really good footwear when in the garden. And when it comes to, how do you sort of keep snakes out of your garden? I always try to tell people to maintain a line of sight. I say, if you can see it, you can be safe because you can leave it alone. Long grass often comes up as, a topic about providing a habitat for snakes. I call it more of a corridor or a highway for snakes. They like to pass through it. That doesn't really provide much opportunity to live in, but it's a good opportunity to evade predation from birds and other animals. So they'll pass through it. So if you keep your grass nice and low, and you can maintain visibility, you're always able to stay safe because you can leave a snake alone or even have it sort of relocated if need be. And, a dense low canopy within your garden provides a good place of shelter. So where possible, if you can sort of lift the canopy of your plants up a little bit, again, to maintain that line of sight, again, that's a really good way of sort of being able to move about your garden pretty freely. All right, so we're sort of coming towards the end. I'm mindful of the time, and I just thought I'd sort of, as we finish off, these are what I call a couple of plants, or what I call my snake catcher's kryptonite. If ever I walk into a property where there's a snake or a snake these are the plants I don't want to see. Agapanthus. Sure, the flowers might be pretty, but the plants, when they clump together and do what they do, including out in the wild, they form this incredible network through their adventitious roots. And snakes, once they are in those, they're impossible to find and remove. Kikuyu is a bit the same. If kikuyu escapes from the lawn and becomes that sort of weedy plant, all those sort of stolons and rhizomes, they all knit together as well. And it makes, if a snake disappears into that, they're almost impossible as well to remove. And it goes without saying, blackberries. There's nothing like rifling through a bramble bush, being pricked on the finger by a prickle, and you're never quite sure if it's a snake or if it's a prickle. So those bramble plants as well provide a good area for snakes to shelter and ultimately escape as well if need be. So obviously, one of those or two of those are common garden plants with one, a declared weed. So if you can control any of those sorts of weeds and, maybe substitute some of those plants with some more, sympathetic indigenous plants. If you're going to plant, say, grassy-like plants, some of your lamandras and stuff make great replacements for agapanthus. If you've got kikuyu as a lawn, I'd always encourage people to don't let it escape the lawn. Keep it low. And don't let it into your garden beds because once it's in there, it's very hard to control. And again, blackberries, like I said, where possible, control blackberries. So I think I've whizzed through the slides pretty fast, maybe too fast. I'm not sure, Ailish. I think we've gone well past where we maybe thought of.
Yeah, that's okay.
And I'm sure I've left a few things out, but I'm more than happy to answer as many questions as time permits as well.
Thank you, Pete. And yeah, thank you for a very informative presentation. You actually did a great job of answering things as the questions were coming through in your presentation. So I feel like, a lot of the questions you've actually answered quite well. There was one question here: what size mesh will stop snakes? Thinking chicken coop mesh, or would I need to go smaller than sort of
definitely
12
smaller?
millimeters?
Yeah, snake, even a sort of sub-adult snake. Bear in mind, our local snakes don't get very big. They'll pass through that. And worst case scenario, they'll try and pass through it, get stuck, and they won't be able to get out of it. It's a bit like the bird netting. I think the standard, what they call mouse mesh, maybe about 5 mil. There's no snakes that can really pass through that. Even neonate snakes won't be able to pass through it. They may be able to climb over a fence constructed. But that mesh would be able to, that would stop a snake passing through it for sure.
Yeah, thank you. I will say as well, in regards to the bird netting, that you mentioned it being on the ground for snakes. And of course, if it's up in trees, you get things like bats getting stuck as well. So yeah, definitely
Absolutely.
something to be mindful of. Question maybe for Ricardo. I know this is a very difficult one, but do you have any thoughts on controlling Indian miners, and maybe could wildlife gardening contribute to that?
Yeah, good question. We actually ran a trial at the gardens quite a few years back, trying to see if there would be any difference in the number of common miners if we did some trapping. The results were not favourable in that we spent a lot of time and effort trying to reduce the numbers, and they just kept arriving from the neighbouring area. So what we concluded, and there's been actual research done on this, is that the best approach is still landscape modification or habitat modification. So we know what common miners prefer. They like that sort of open grassy area where they've got access to nearby trees and cover. So yeah, the best we can do is to try and return most of our landscapes to a more natural state, which is to say usually trees, shrubs. So those layers that I was talking about in my slides about providing habitat, that would not be providing habitat to the common miner. They wouldn't like that kind of landscape.
Thank you. We might need to wrap it up there, everyone. We've gone a bit over time, but I hope that this has been informative, answered some of your questions, and I'll just say it again. My email is sbb@rbg.vic.gov.au, or you can just find me on the Royal Botanic Gardens website. Oh, there's a slide. There you go. There's my email for anything related to bandicoots or bandicoot gates. Or if you have a question for any of our panelists, I may even be able to pass it on to them. No guarantees, but I just thought I'd put that out there. So thank you for coming along. As I said, this should be up on our YouTube channel, Royal Botanic Gardens Victoria on YouTube. So if you wanted to watch it back, please check there in a few days. Thanks everyone for coming along.